I set the folder of invoices down on Rebecca's dining table, the edges crisp from the certified mail envelope I'd carried in. Her hand froze on the stem of her wine glass, and for once she didn't have a quick remark. If you're watching this, subscribe and comment where you're watching from. You're really going through with this? She asked, her voice sharp as the clink of glass against wood. I looked her straight in the eye. You called me a leech, Rebecca. You told cousins I was draining you. But this, I tapped the folder, this shows exactly the opposite. Her boutique smelled faintly of lavender candles and new fabric, but underneath it all was the sour note of deceit. My own daughter, flesh of my flesh, had twisted the truth so deeply that neighbors whispered, church friends avoided me, and family texts dried up. She thought she could shame me into silence. That night, I'd had enough. The paper trail told a story even sharper than my voice ever could. And I was ready to let it speak in the only place she couldn't talk over me, a courtroom. You might be thinking, how does a 74-year-old woman decide to take her own child to small claims court? Trust me, I asked myself the same thing. But after being called a parasite, after being shoved toward the door of my own home, I realized I wasn't the one clinging. She was. I lifted the receipt at the top of the stack, the date circled in red ink. This, I said quietly, is where the truth starts. If that sounds harsh, here's how I got there. I remember sitting at my kitchen table the night after that confrontation, the hum of the old refrigerator filling the silence. The house felt too big, too empty, like even the walls were tired of holding secrets. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I folded and unfolded the same napkin, over and over. I kept hearing that word, *leech*, echoing in my head, sharper than any insult I'd ever been called. All my life, I believed family peace was worth more than my pride. Growing up in Dayton, Ohio, in the 1950s, I was taught to keep things polite, to smooth over conflicts, to let it slide. My late husband, Harold, used to call me the peacemaker. And maybe I wore that badge too proudly. I thought keeping the family together meant swallowing my anger, even when it burned. But here's the thing I didn't admit for years, peace without boundaries isn't really peace. It's just silence that eats you alive. I used to think I could buy my daughter's love. Not with gifts or trinkets, but with sacrifices she never saw. I lent her money when her boutique struggled. I co-signed her loan even though I knew my savings were tight. I babysat her kids, drove them across town to soccer games, even slipped grocery money into her purse when I saw the cupboards running low. I told myself, this is what mothers do. But when she called me a leech, it shattered something I didn't even realize I'd been holding together with string. It wasn't just disrespect, it was a rewriting of the story I'd been telling myself. Suddenly, I was the burden. The dependent. The one who drained. And the worst part? A small part of me believed her. I sat there, tallying up every ride she'd given me, every bill she might have covered when Harold's pension check came late. It was like my own mind was standing trial, and I had no defense. Until I opened that folder. Inside were the promissory notes, the handwritten checks, even the text messages where she thanked me for covering rent or buying supplies for her shop. Each one was proof that I wasn't the leech, she was the one who'd leaned on me. The truth was sitting right there in black and white. That realization didn't make me feel powerful right away. It just made me tired. Tired of pretending my silence was noble. Tired of believing love meant giving without asking for respect in return. What if I had been wrong all along? What if protecting her from consequences was the very thing that had allowed her to treat me like this? I stared at that folder for hours, the lamplight catching the edges of the pages, until my eyes blurred. I thought about the lesson Harold used to tell his students. He taught history at the high school, that ignoring small injustices only breeds bigger ones. The little lies always lead to the big ones, he'd say. I used to nod along, but I never applied it to my own life. That night I finally understood. By keeping quiet, I'd been building the stage for this whole cruel performance. And if I wanted any peace in my last years, I had to rewrite the ending. But it didn't start that night. It started months earlier. I guess I should start with last spring, because that's when the cracks really began to show. It was late March in Dayton, still chilly, the kind of weather where you keep the furnace running at night but open a window during the day just to feel a breeze. Rebecca came over one Sunday afternoon, kids in tow, saying she needed to talk. I had a pot roast in the oven, the kind Harold always used to carve, and the house smelled of onions and rosemary. She sat at my kitchen table, fiddling with her phone more than looking at me. "Mom," she started, "I need a little help again. Just until the boutique gets back on its feet." I'd heard this line before. Her boutique, Rebecca Lynn Stiles, was her dream, her baby, the thing she said would prove to everyone she didn't need to work at the insurance office forever. I admired her grit, but I also knew the numbers. Rent on the shop was $1,200 a month, supplies another $500 at least, and I'd already lent her close to $8,000 over 2 years. I'd kept every canceled check and every Venmo receipt in a manila folder marked Rebecca Loans. That day, she asked for $2,000 more. I remember taking a deep breath, the kind that feels like it scrapes your ribs on the way out. "Rebecca," I said, "you've got to start treating this like a business, not a piggy bank. I can't keep floating you." Her eyes narrowed. "You don't understand how hard it is, Mom. Rent, utilities, payroll. You had Dad's steady job, a pension. I'm out here building something from scratch." She had a point, in her way. Harold's pension kept the lights on, along with my modest retirement savings from 35 years at the library. But what she forgot, or maybe chose to forget, was that I wasn't a bottomless well. Every dollar I gave her was a dollar I didn't have for my prescriptions, or the new roof the house desperately needed, or even just a little cushion for emergencies. I lent her the $2,000 anyway. I told myself it was for the grandkids' future, that the shop might finally take off. But that night, I filed the receipt under Rebecca Loans with a heaviness in my chest I couldn't shake. A month later, the first complication came. I was at Kroger, standing in line with my cart, when I overheard two of my church friends, Mrs. Ellis and Janine, whispering near the deli. They didn't see me, but I heard my daughter's name. "Rebecca says her mom's always asking for money," Janine murmured. Mrs. Ellis clucked her tongue. Can you imagine? Poor girl trying to run a shop, and her mother's draining her? I felt my face go hot. My hands gripped the cart handle so tight I thought the plastic would crack. That was the first time I realized Rebecca wasn't just taking my money, she was rewriting the story. To everyone else, I was the dependent. That night I pulled out the manila folder again, laid out the checks and receipts across my bedspread. Proof. I wasn't crazy. But proof doesn't mean much if you're the only one who sees it. The second mini-scene came in May. Rebecca dropped by again, kids racing through my living room while she scrolled her phone. She looked exhausted, but also oddly smug, like she had a secret. "Mom, I might be getting a grant," she said, her voice almost casual. "There's a program for small women-owned businesses. If it comes through, things will be different." I perked up. "That's wonderful. How much?" She shrugged, like it wasn't worth talking about. "Depends. Could be a few thousand, could be more." I didn't think much of it then. I just nodded, happy she might have a lifeline that didn't involve my checkbook. What I didn't know until months later was that she did get that grant, and kept asking me for money anyway. The third turning point came in July, at my grandson's baseball game. It was one of those humid Ohio evenings where the air feels like soup and the mosquitoes don't quit. I was sitting on the bleachers, fanning myself with the program, when Rebecca's husband, Mark, plopped down beside me. "Eleanor," he said, not unkindly, "you've got to ease up on Rebecca. She says you're always pressing her about money, making her feel guilty." I nearly dropped the program. I'm making her feel guilty? Mark, I've given her thousands of dollars. I've got the paperwork to prove it. He shook his head, like I'd missed the point. She feels pressured. Maybe just let it go? I stared out at the ball field, at my grandson swinging at pitches, and I realized I was being painted into a corner. My own son-in-law thought I was the problem. My daughter was twisting the truth so thoroughly that even her husband believed it. That night, when I got home, I opened the manila folder again. Only this time, I pulled out a notebook. I started listing dates, amounts, and what each loan had been for. Supplies, rent, payroll. I even taped in screenshots of texts. If Rebecca was rewriting the story, then I was going to write my own, carefully, fact by fact. Looking back, I think that was the real turning point. I stopped being just a quiet lender and started becoming my own record keeper, my own witness. Which brings me to the plan I should have made sooner. I remember the exact night the plan clicked into place. It was early August, the kind of muggy Ohio evening when the cicadas outside drown out your thoughts. I sat at my kitchen table with the manila folder spread open, papers fanned out like a deck of cards. The air smelled faintly of coffee, though my mug had gone cold hours before. For weeks, I'd been replaying Rebecca's words in my head. Leech, it clung to me, heavier than the humidity. I'd tried to ignore it, to reason with her, to hope she'd come to her senses. But every glance at those receipts told me hope wasn't enough. That night, I pulled out a yellow legal pad and wrote across the top, my plan. I wasn't going to scream at her. I wasn't going to trash her to the family or fire back in church gossip. That wasn't my way. But I also wasn't going to sit by while she painted me as a parasite. I had something she didn't think I'd ever use, proof. The plan was simple, legal, and airtight. Step 1, put everything in writing. Certified mail, with return receipts. No more casual texts, no more just helping out. If she owed me money, it would be documented. Step 2, give her one last chance to repay through a formal demand letter. Step 3, if she refused, which I suspected she would, I'd take her to small claims court. Montgomery County's limit was $6,000, and I had enough receipts to fill that and then some. The stakes were high, and not just financially. If I lost, the family would see me as vindictive, maybe even bitter. But if I won, the truth would finally be on record, and she'd have no choice but to face it. I remember staring at the neat stack of papers, feeling both terrified and strangely calm. Could I really take my own daughter to court? The thought made my chest tighten. But then I pictured the way Mrs. Ellis had looked at me in the grocery store, pity mixed with suspicion, as if I really had been mooching off Rebecca. That memory burned hot enough to steel my resolve. I wasn't chasing revenge for the sake of it. I wanted my dignity back. And if Rebecca wouldn't hand it over willingly, the courthouse would help me take it. I circled a date on my calendar, 30 days from when I'd send the demand letter. That was her window to set things right before I filed. As I capped my pen and closed the folder, I whispered to the quiet kitchen, "This time, Rebecca, it won't just be my word against yours." Then the pushback started. The first complication came sooner than I expected. I mailed the certified letter on a Monday morning, standing in line at the post office with a weight in my chest and a tremor in my hand. The clerk stamped it, slid it into the outgoing tray, and I felt something shift, like once that envelope left my possession, there was no turning back. 3 days later, the green return receipt card came back to me with Rebecca's neat signature scrawled across it. Proof she had received my demand. Proof she couldn't deny later. That should have given me a sense of control, but instead, it was like lighting a fuse and waiting for the sound of the explosion. The phone rang that evening. I didn't have to check the caller ID to know who it was. Her voice came sharp and hot through the line. Are you out of your mind, Mother? Sending me some lawyer-style letter like I'm a criminal? She didn't even let me answer before she went on. Do you have any idea what this does to me? What if someone at the shop sees this? What if the kids hear about it? I wanted to stay calm, to explain that it wasn't about humiliating her, only about making things fair. But every time I tried to speak, she bulldozed over me. You're 76 years old and you're threatening your own daughter with court. What kind of mother does that? Her words dripped with venom, and when she finally slammed the phone down, I was left clutching the receiver like a lifeline. The next morning, the family group chat lit up. My son-in-law sent me a curt message. What's this about court papers? Rebecca is crying her eyes out. Then my granddaughter texted me privately, accusing me of trying to destroy her mother's reputation. I stared at those little blue bubbles on my phone, messages from the very people I had once fed at my kitchen table, driven to school, tucked into bed. It felt like they were slipping through my fingers, siding with Rebecca without ever asking me why. But that wasn't the worst part. Word started spreading outside the family. At church the following Sunday, Mrs. Ellis avoided me altogether, her head bent as though the hymn book was suddenly fascinating. Pastor Jim gave me one of those long, searching looks before launching into his sermon on forgiveness. It didn't take a genius to see where that was pointed. People who had known me for decades now looked at me with quiet suspicion, as if I were the one stirring trouble. I left before the last hymn ended, walking across the parking lot with my head held high but my insides churning. Meanwhile, Rebecca didn't stay idle. Instead of responding to the demand letter, she began her own counteroffensive. I heard through a cousin that she'd been telling anyone who would listen that I was slipping into old-age paranoia, that I was confused, misremembering events, maybe even unwell. She's not herself these days, Rebecca reportedly said, putting on that concerned tone she wore like a costume. She gets things mixed up. I think she might be depressed or losing track of reality. It was a clever move. By painting me as fragile and unreliable, she was trying to undercut the very foundation of my case before it even hit the courtroom. It hurt in ways I can hardly describe. I've always prided myself on being sharp. I still balance my own checkbook, still read the paper every morning, still remember the birthdays of every grandchild. To have my own daughter spread lies about my mind, it felt like she was stealing the last of my independence, rewriting me as a doddering old woman. And people believed her. Or at least, they wanted to. It's easier to dismiss an old woman's story than confront the possibility that a respected small business owner might be lying. For a few nights, I doubted myself. I sat at my kitchen table with those receipts, staring at the ink until my eyes blurred, asking myself if maybe I was making too much of it. Maybe I should just let it go. But then I'd remember Rebecca's voice, sharp with disdain, calling me a leech. I'd remember all the rides, the babysitting, the checks written when Harold's pension barely covered my own bills. Those memories grounded me. They told me I wasn't crazy. I decided if Rebecca wanted to play dirty, I'd have to be thorough. I started organizing every scrap of paper into chronological order. I printed out bank statements, highlighted transfers, even dug up text messages where she thanked me for paying off her supplier. It wasn't enough to tell the truth, I had to show it, beyond any doubt. But complications kept piling on. My younger sister, Margaret, who had always been the peacemaker between us, called me one evening with a tone I recognized immediately, half scolding, half pleading. "Beatrice," she said, "you've got to stop this. She's your only daughter. Family shouldn't take family to court. It's not Christian. Christian doesn't mean being a doormat, I snapped back, surprising even myself with the steel in my voice. But after I hung up, I sat in the dark, shaken. I knew Margaret meant well, but her words echoed the same chorus I was hearing everywhere: drop it, forgive, forget. No one seemed to care about the weight I'd carried, about the truth sitting in my folder. They only cared about keeping the surface calm. The emotional toll was heavier than I had imagined. At night, sleep wouldn't come easily. I'd lie awake, the ceiling fan clicking overhead, my mind racing through worst-case scenarios. What if the judge believed her version? What if the family cut me off completely? What if I ended up the villain in every story they told about me from here on out? The practical obstacles weren't small either. Filing the claim meant more than just dropping papers at the courthouse. I had to fill out forms that seemed designed to confuse, gather exact dollar amounts, make copies of everything. The courthouse clerk spoke quickly, assuming I understood the jargon. I left with a stack of instructions that felt like they weighed more than the folder in my arms. At 76, my body didn't move the way it used to. Even driving downtown and navigating parking was exhausting. And then came the moment that nearly broke me. One afternoon, I went to pick up my prescription from the pharmacy, and the young clerk behind the counter gave me a look I'd never forget, half pity, half judgment. I heard about what's going on, she said softly, leaning forward. With your daughter. My cheeks burned. That meant Rebecca's story wasn't just in family circles or church pews anymore. It was out in the open, seeping into the community. My reputation, carefully built over 76 years, was being chipped away one whisper at a time. I drove home with my prescription bottle rattling in the paper bag, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. Part of me wanted to slam on the brakes, turn around, and march into Rebecca's shop to scream the truth until every customer heard it. But I knew that wouldn't fix anything. She would twist it, make me look hysterical. So I kept to the plan. I circled the date on the calendar, the day her 30 days would expire, and I tried to push through the noise. But every passing day, every phone call, every whisper made the path ahead feel steeper, like I was climbing a hill that might never end. I knew one thing, though: if I backed down now, I'd be proving her right. And I refused to let my last years be defined as the years when I lost myself to silence. The complications were multiplying, but beneath the fear and the exhaustion, something else was growing too: resolve. I could feel it in my bones. Rebecca thought she could shame me into surrender. She didn't realize that all she was doing was sharpening my determination. And by the time the deadline came, I was ready for whatever storm she wanted to unleash. The deadline I'd circled on the calendar came and went without so much as a phone call from Rebecca. Not a payment, not an apology, not even a half-hearted excuse. I drove down to the courthouse in Dayton on a brisk Tuesday morning, the kind where the autumn air nipped sharp enough to wake every nerve in your body. My hands shook as I clutched the folder against my chest, but I reminded myself, I wasn't doing this out of spite. I was doing it for truth. The clerk stamped my papers, filed them neatly, and slid me a copy of the court date. Just like that, it was official. The fuse I'd lit weeks earlier wasn't just hissing anymore, it was roaring toward the dynamite. As I walked out of the courthouse, the weight in my chest shifted. For the first time in months, I wasn't just reacting. I had taken action. But that's when Rebecca escalated. 2 days later, a letter arrived from her attorney. She hadn't hired some run-of-the-mill lawyer either. This was a name I recognized, a man who'd represented half the prominent business owners in Montgomery County. The letter was cold, clinical, and devastating. It accused me of harassment, of elder confusion, of trying to shake down my own daughter with fabricated debts. Fabricated. The word made my blood boil. And then came the dagger. If I pursued the case, Rebecca would file a countersuit for defamation and emotional distress. Suddenly the ground I thought I was standing on felt like quicksand. I wasn't just risking losing the case, I was risking being branded as a liar in the eyes of the law. I sat at my kitchen table that night, the lawyer's letter spread open, my folder of evidence beside it. For the first time, doubt crept in deep enough to rattle me. Could Rebecca really twist this into me being the aggressor? Could she ruin me financially on top of everything else? I didn't have the savings to fight a drawn-out legal battle. My pension barely covered utilities and groceries as it was. But then I remembered something Harold used to say when his students panicked before exams: the truth doesn't panic, only lies do. I took a breath and looked back at my receipts. These weren't stories or fuzzy memories. These were checks, bank transfers, text messages. Tangible proof. If Rebecca wanted to fight dirty, I'd simply shine a brighter light. Still, the emotional toll was crushing. My sister Margaret called again, begging me to drop it before things got uglier. My granddaughter sent a message that sliced me open. "Grandma, why are you trying to ruin Mom? Don't you love us anymore?" That night, I wept into my pillow until it was damp, my body shaking with the weight of it all. I wasn't just fighting Rebecca. I was fighting the whole tide of family loyalty she had turned against me. And yet, the very next morning, something shifted inside me. I woke up with swollen eyes but a steadier heart. Maybe this was the price of finally standing up for myself. Maybe peace wasn't quiet dinners and forced smiles, it was choosing to walk through fire rather than live forever under someone else's shadow. So I doubled down. I contacted a retired lawyer from church, Mr. Landon, who agreed to look over my documents for free. He was slow, deliberate, his fingers trembling almost as much as mine as he flipped through the folder. But after half an hour, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Beatrice, this isn't harassment. This is debt. You've got a case." His words were like water to a parched throat. For the first time, I had someone besides myself affirming I wasn't crazy. He gave me advice on how to organize the evidence, how to frame my story so the judge would see it clearly. "Keep it factual," he said. "Don't get drawn into the emotion. Let the paper do the talking." The midpoint came 1 week before the hearing. Rebecca showed up at my house unannounced. I opened the door to find her standing there, eyes blazing, lips pressed tight. She didn't wait to be invited in, she barged past me into the living room, pacing like a caged animal. "You think you're going to humiliate me in public?" she hissed. "You think a judge is going to believe some wrinkled-up story over me?" "Over me?" I told her calmly, "It's not a story, Rebecca. It's proof. And it's not just between us anymore. It's going before the court." That's when she snapped. She picked up one of Harold's old photo frames from the mantel, him in his army uniform, young and proud, and she hurled it across the room. Glass shattered against the wall, shards skittering across the carpet. My heart clenched, not from fear, but from grief. She wasn't just attacking me, she was desecrating the memory of the man who had taught us both better. "You'll regret this," she spat, before storming out the door and slamming it so hard the windows rattled. I stood there in the silence afterward, staring at the broken glass, my hands trembling. For a brief moment, I considered giving in, calling the courthouse to withdraw the case. But as I bent down to pick up Harold's photograph, the young soldier smiling back at me through the cracked glass, I felt him steadying me. I whispered, "I won't let her win, Harold. Not like this." And in that moment, the story shifted. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was fighting for every sacrifice I had ever made, for every truth I had swallowed to keep peace, for every older parent who had ever been rewritten as a burden. The fuse wasn't just hissing anymore. It had reached the dynamite. And the explosion was coming in court. The morning of the hearing, I woke before dawn. The house was so quiet I could hear the tick of the clock in the hallway, steady as a heartbeat. I boiled water for tea but couldn't bring myself to drink it. My stomach felt twisted tight as a knot. On the table sat the folder I had spent weeks organizing, color-coded tabs sticking out like little flags. It looked almost too neat, as if order alone could protect me from the chaos that awaited. The courthouse in Dayton smelled of polished floors and stale paper. I shuffled through the metal detector, clutching my folder close, and sat on a hard wooden bench outside the courtroom. Rebecca arrived 20 minutes later, dressed in a sleek navy suit that made her look every bit the successful shop owner she claimed to be. She didn't glance my way. Behind her trailed her attorney, tall, smooth-talking, with the air of someone who'd won more cases than he'd lost. When the bailiff called our case, my knees wobbled as I rose. Inside the courtroom, the air felt charged, heavy. The judge, a stern woman with wire-rimmed glasses, peered down from the bench as if she could already sense the mess of family ties knotted into this case. Rebecca's lawyer spoke first. His voice was honeyed, deliberate, every word laced with contempt cloaked as concern. He painted me as a confused old woman, struggling with the natural difficulties of age. He suggested my recollections were misinterpretations, that I had misconstrued the support between mother and daughter as financial obligation. When he mentioned that Rebecca's emotional well-being had been deeply compromised by these unfounded claims, I saw Rebecca lower her face into her hands, dabbing at imaginary tears with a tissue. Theatrics, pure and polished. When it was my turn, I stood slowly, steadying myself with the edge of the table. My heart pounded so loudly I wondered if the judge could hear it. I didn't try to match the lawyer's polish. I let the papers do the talking. This, I said, holding up a copy of a check, is dated March 14, 2017. I paid $2000 directly to Rebecca's boutique supplier. Here is her text message thanking me the next day. I handed both to the bailiff, who passed them to the judge. I continued, one by one, laying out the receipts, the transfers, the notes scribbled in her handwriting. I'll pay you back, Mom, I promise. Each piece landed like a stone on the scale, tilting it slowly in my favor. My voice shook at first, but with every document I presented, my spine straightened. By the time I finished, I was no longer trembling. The judge sifted through the evidence, her expression unreadable. Then she turned to Rebecca. Do you dispute the authenticity of these records? Rebecca's lawyer opened his mouth, but the judge raised her hand. I'm asking your client. Rebecca hesitated, her lips tightening. Finally, she muttered, no, but those weren't loans. They were help. She wanted to help me. Then why, the judge said, lifting a note, does this say, I'll repay you as soon as business picks up? Rebecca's face flushed crimson. She glanced at her lawyer, but he didn't speak. In that silence, something inside me nodded. For years, I'd let her twist the story, cast me as needy, as weak. But in this room, under oath, her words faltered, and mine held steady. The judge finally leaned back, folded her hands, and delivered the ruling. This court finds sufficient evidence of financial obligation. Judgment is granted to the plaintiff in the amount of $6,000 plus court fees. It was done. Just like that, the truth had been carved into the record, permanent and undeniable. Rebecca didn't look at me as the gavel struck. She stormed out of the courtroom, her heels clicking sharp against the tile. Her lawyer trailed behind, whispering something she brushed off with a wave of her hand. I remained seated for a moment, gripping the edge of the table, letting the air finally fill my lungs again. I wasn't gloating, and I wasn't even smiling. What I felt was quieter, deeper. Relief, yes. But more than that, vindication. For once, the the story couldn't be rewritten. As I gathered my folder and walked out of the courtroom, the hallway seemed brighter than when I had entered. Strangers milled about, some glancing curiously, none knowing the years of history that had led to that judgment. But I knew. And for the first time in a long time, I walked without the weight of Rebecca's shadow pressing me down. I had stood my ground. And I had won. I thought the judgment would be the final word. For a week, I moved through my days lighter, humming while I folded laundry, even lingering over coffee at the diner on Main Street. Folks there knew me as the quiet one, the lady who always read the paper cover to cover. But that week I actually laughed with the waitress when she mixed up my order. $6,000 wasn't a fortune, but it was recognition, justice carved into paper with a court seal. Rebecca didn't call. I assumed she was licking her wounds. My lawyer friend from church told me not to expect payment right away, but with the judgment entered, enforcement would follow. I trusted the system. Maybe I was naive. 2 weeks later, a thin envelope slid into my mailbox. The return address had Rebecca's boutique logo stamped in gold. I almost didn't open it, assuming it was a passive-aggressive bill for some trumped-up debt. Instead, it was a letter from her lawyer. Cold, clinical. Our client intends to appeal the judgment. Collection efforts will be contested. Any attempt to enforce will be met with further litigation. My chest tightened as I read the words. Appeal? More litigation? I thought it was settled. I sat on the porch steps, the Ohio summer air heavy and still, cicadas buzzing like static in my ears. My hands trembled so badly I almost dropped the letter. The next day, I went to the bank to check if Rebecca had even a cent I could collect on. The clerk pulled up the account tied to her boutique and shook her head. Closed 2 days ago, she said softly. Funds moved out. Moved out. I heard those 2 words echo over and over, like a taunt. My so-called victory was already slipping through my fingers. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, the ceiling fan spinning slow circles, while every doubt crept back in. What if she dragged this out for years? What if she'd hidden her money so well that the judgment was just ink on paper, useless as a grocery list? My throat burned with the unfairness of it. I had followed every rule, played clean, believed the system would hold. Yet here she was, bending reality again. And then came the sting that cut deeper than any legal maneuver. My niece, Sarah, sweet, gullible Sarah, called me in tears. Aunt Eleanor, why are you trying to ruin Mom's life? Her voice cracked. She said you're obsessed with money, that you're suing her because you're bitter and lonely. I pressed the phone to my ear, speechless. Rebecca hadn't just filed papers. She'd poisoned the well of family. Twisting me into the villain, turning sympathy her way, just as she'd always done. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen, staring at the folder still on the counter. The same folder that had won me the case now looked flimsy, almost laughable against Rebecca's endless appetite for twisting truth. My stomach clenched, my palms damp. Victory? That word felt hollow. My body knew it, too. My chest was heavy, my shoulders knotted, and every breath came shallow, as if I was bracing for a blow that hadn't landed yet. I thought it was over. I thought I could finally breathe. But all it took was one letter, one phone call, and I felt the ground tilt beneath me again. Until one line in an old message changed everything. I couldn't stop replaying Sarah's words in my head. Bitter. Lonely. Obsessed with money. That wasn't me, but Rebecca was so skilled at weaving her version of the story that even good people started to believe her. I sat at the kitchen table one night, sifting through the folder again, not because I needed to, but because touching those papers gave me something solid when my own family's trust felt slippery. It was then I noticed an old email tucked between receipts. The subject line read, "Grant confirmation, boutique expansion." I'd filed it months ago, back when Rebecca begged me for bridge money to cover new inventory. She had forwarded it by accident, attached to an invoice she wanted me to pay. The email was from the Ohio Small Business Development Center. It congratulated Rebecca on receiving a $15,000 grant for women entrepreneurs, dated 3 weeks before she'd asked me for that $2,000 emergency payment. My heart pounded as I read the lines again. She hadn't needed me at all. She already had money in hand. I sat back, the room spinning. All those nights she cried on the phone, swearing her boutique would shut down without me, calling me her lifeline. Lies. Every single one. She hadn't just leaned on me, she'd used me as a free bankroll, pocketing her grant while siphoning mine. The memory of her standing in court, dabbing at fake tears, slammed into me like a wave. She'd looked the judge in the eye and painted herself as struggling, desperate. Meanwhile, she had 15 grand sitting in her account. And then she had the audacity to call me a leech. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring at the glow of my old laptop screen. My pulse thudded in my ears, hot and sharp. But underneath the anger, something steadier took root, clarity. Rebecca didn't just owe me money. She owed me truth. And now I had proof she'd hidden resources while crying poor to her family, to the court, maybe even to her suppliers. That email wasn't just another piece of paper. It was the missing puzzle piece that reframed everything. She wasn't a daughter who made mistakes under pressure. She was someone who knew exactly what she was doing, taking what she could, rewriting the story, and betting I'd be too timid, too old, to fight back. But she'd miscalculated. Because with that grant document in my hands, I suddenly knew exactly where to stand. The next morning, I walked into the Montgomery County Clerk's office with that grant email printed out and tucked neatly in my folder. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the line moved slow, but I felt something I hadn't in months: purpose. When my turn came, I explained to the clerk, a young man who couldn't have been older than 25, that I wanted to file a motion to enforce the judgment. I handed over the grant confirmation as supporting evidence. He looked at the paper, eyebrows raised. "This shows she had funds available when she told the court she didn't," he said. "Exactly," I replied. My voice was calm, measured. She misrepresented her financial situation. The clerk stamped my motion, and I walked out with the kind of receipt you don't throw away, one with a case number that meant the system was officially in motion. At 9:12 a.m. the next day, I stood at the window of Fifth Third Bank on Main Street. I slid the garnishment order across to the teller. She glanced at the papers, typed quickly, then disappeared into the back. My heart hammered as I waited, palms pressed against the cool counter. 5 minutes felt like 50. When she returned, she said simply, "The order will be processed. Funds will be frozen immediately." I left the bank without looking back, the Ohio sun glaring hot on the sidewalk, and drove straight to the courthouse for the next step. At 3:40 p.m., I was at the county clerk again, filing a lien against Rebecca's boutique property. The paperwork was dry, technical, but I handled each page like it was a weapon sharpened just for me. The clerk explained that until she paid, that lien would shadow her shop, hanging there for anyone to see. Investors, landlords, even customers curious enough to look. In between those appointments, my days blurred into a montage of routine but necessary tasks: notarizing forms at the UPS store, making copies at the library where I'd once shelved books, mailing certified letters with the weight of evidence inside. Each envelope I sealed felt like one more nail in the coffin of her lies. Not everything was cold paper, though. One afternoon, as I left the courthouse, I bumped into a local reporter, David, who'd once covered the small business awards Rebecca had won. He remembered her name instantly. Didn't she get some kind of grant last year? He asked casually. I met his eyes and said, funny you mention that. I have the proof right here. I tapped my folder. His eyebrows shot up. That's newsworthy, Eleanor. If she misused or misrepresented grant money, people would want to know. I didn't hand him the papers, not yet, but I could see in his face what I already knew. Rebecca's polished public image wasn't as bulletproof as she thought. By the end of the week, Rebecca's boutique account was frozen, and the lien notice had been posted. Calls started coming in, not to me at first, but to her. Suppliers demanding answers. Her landlord wondering if rent would be affected. Eventually, my phone rang, her number flashing across the screen. Her voice, once so sharp and self-assured, now cracked with panic. Mom, why are you doing this? You're destroying me. I let the silence hang for a long moment. Then I said quietly, no, Rebecca. You did this when you lied, when you called me a leech, when you thought you could bury me under your stories. I just followed the rules. She cried, begged, even tried bargaining, offering half, then less. I kept my tone steady, calm, like the gavel I'd heard strike in that courtroom. The court said $6,000. That's what you'll pay. Nothing less. When the call ended, I set the phone down and exhaled. My body felt lighter, adrenaline fading into something steadier, resolve. I hadn't yelled, hadn't stooped to her level. I'd simply enforced what was mine, by the book, step by step. And that's when the other calls started. Rebecca didn't fold gracefully. That much I knew the moment her boutique's Instagram page went dark, replaced by a plain white square with the words asterisk closed for inventory. Asterisk a week passed. The doors never reopened. Word trickled through town that her landlord had changed the locks after 2 rent checks bounced. The once bustling boutique with its trendy window displays now sat empty, paper covering the glass like a shroud. For a while, I avoided driving past it. The truth is, despite everything, seeing her failure laid bare like that wasn't easy. She was still my daughter. But when I finally did pass by, one quiet Thursday morning, the sight didn't bring me pain, it brought me clarity. She hadn't been ruined by me. She had been ruined by her own choices. I had just made sure the truth came to light. The garnishment went through cleanly. 2 deposits from her frozen account hit my bank, neatly adding up to the $6,000 she owed. When I saw the balance, I didn't celebrate with champagne or some grand gesture. I simply made a transfer, half to my savings, half to a local literacy nonprofit where I volunteered. For years, Rebecca had said I cared more about strangers than my own blood. Maybe she was right. But at least those strangers didn't spit on the hand that helped them. Fallout came in other forms too. The reporter I'd spoken with, David, ran a small piece in the Dayton Daily News. Nothing sensational, nothing cruel, just a short article about how certain boutique owners had failed to disclose prior grants while seeking additional funding. He never mentioned Rebecca by name, but everyone who followed the local business scene connected the dots. Her so-called peers whispered, and customers turned away. The reputation she'd built on glitter and self-pity cracked like a porcelain mask. Family fallout was harsher. My younger son, Mark, called one evening, his tone caught between worry and accusation. Mom, Rebecca says you went nuclear. That you ruined her shop. Is it true? I sighed into the receiver. Mark, I enforced a judgment the court already gave me. She lied to you, she lied to the court, and she lied to herself. I just stopped letting her lies cost me. There was a long pause. I don't know, Mom, he finally said. It just feels final. It is final, I said gently. Because I'm too old to play her games anymore. I gave her chances. She chose pride over honesty. Don't mistake boundaries for cruelty. Mark didn't argue further, but his calls grew less frequent. That stung more than I wanted to admit. Rebecca's spiral hadn't just cost her business, it had driven deeper cracks into our family tree. And yet, not every consequence was bitter. Neighbors who had once eyed me with pity now greeted me with a quiet respect. At church, when people heard whispers about the Grant thing, they didn't look at me with suspicion. They looked at me as if I had done what many wished they could, stood up to betrayal, even when it came from blood. The strangest shift came inside myself. For months I had lived under Rebecca's shadow, ashamed of the lies she spun, doubting my own worth, even questioning whether my memory of events was sharp enough. But as the weeks passed, that fog lifted. I slept better. I laughed more during book club meetings. I started walking every morning again, greeting the dawn with steady steps instead of heavy thoughts. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sky turn orange, I realized something. Rebecca might never forgive me, and maybe Mark would always see me as the mother who went nuclear. But I could live with that. What I couldn't live with anymore was the version of myself who stayed quiet, who let age and guilt keep her tethered to abuse. That woman was gone. The fallout was real, an empty store, a broken relationship, whispers in the family. But so were the consequences for me: freedom, clarity, and the ability to say *I fought back. And I won *. Just when I thought the dust had settled, the real twist arrived in the form of a thick envelope from the county courthouse. I almost didn't open it right away. Legal mail had become a tiring constant these past few months, but the bold black stamp across the top caught my eye: probate notice. I tore it open with shaky fingers, expecting some bureaucratic mistake. Instead, I read that my late sister, Martha, who had passed the year before in Cincinnati, had left a portion of her estate in trust for Rebecca and Eleanor, jointly. My sister had been frugal, but she owned a small rental property that was now worth nearly $120,000. The shock nearly knocked the wind out of me. My sister, who had always said family needed to stay bound together no matter the storms, had unknowingly tied me and Rebecca together with one last rope. According to the will, neither of us could sell or transfer our share without the other's signature. For a few moments, I laughed, a dry, almost bitter sound. Was this fate's cruel joke? After everything, after freezing her accounts, after liens and garnishments, after Rebecca spitting venom about me being bitter and greedy, we were suddenly co-heirs? Bound not by love, but by law? That night, my phone rang again. Rebecca's number. Against my better judgment, I answered. Her voice was small, stripped of its usual sharpness. "Mom, did you get the notice?" "I did," I said, steady but cold. I don't know what to say. Aunt Martha always thought she trailed off. "Be a family," I finished for her. "Yes. But you and I both know family isn't about documents. It's about truth." Silence stretched. Then she whispered, "I need the money, Mom. Please. Can we work this out?" And there it was, the same plea I'd heard 100 times before. Except this time, I held not just leverage, but choice. I told her calmly, "Rebecca, I'll sign when I'm ready. But not because you beg. Not because you guilt me. Only if you show me real change. Otherwise, that property can sit in limbo forever." The line went quiet, then dead. For the first time, I wasn't the one left desperate. The twist of fate had shifted the power entirely. Rebecca thought she had cut me out of her life, erased me with cruel words and courtroom lies. But now, my name was tethered to hers in ink, in value, in something she wanted badly. The irony wasn't lost on me. She once accused me of clinging to money instead of family. Now, it was her turn to learn what it felt like to be dependent. And as I set the notice down, I realized something with startling clarity: the story wasn't quite finished. Not yet. When people ask what I've learned through all of this, I tell them the truth. Betrayal doesn't just wound you, it teaches you. It strips away illusions, forces you to see not just others clearly, but yourself. For a long time, I thought age demanded silence. That at 75, I should just nod, endure, let the younger generation call the shots. I thought love for my daughter meant tolerating her lies, excusing her cruelty, giving without limit. But love without respect isn't love, it's bondage. And respect, I learned, is something you can demand even at 75, even from your own blood. The greatest lesson was this: justice has no expiration date. Courts, banks, liens, motions, they all seemed intimidating, like a labyrinth built for younger, sharper minds. But each form I filled out reminded me I was still capable, still sharp enough to defend myself. Rebecca had counted on me being too old, too weary, too sentimental. She forgot that age isn't weakness. Sometimes, it's armor. I also learned that revenge doesn't have to be fire and fury. It doesn't need screaming matches or slammed doors. True revenge, the kind that heals, can be quiet, methodical, done with a pen instead of a sword. It's not about crushing someone else. It's about refusing to be crushed yourself. The twist with Martha's estate was life's way of driving that point home. Fate will always throw complications at us, ties we didn't choose, knots we can't untangle with anger alone. But even then, we still hold the power of choice, whether to be manipulated again, or to stand firm in dignity. If there's a theme to my story, it's this: standing up for yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary. Especially when you've spent a lifetime being told to sit down, stay quiet, or be the bigger person. Sometimes being the bigger person means drawing the line so deep it can't be crossed again. I can't say Rebecca and I will ever reconcile. Perhaps someday she'll come to me with honesty instead of desperation, and maybe then I'll sign the papers from Martha's estate. Or maybe not. Either way, I'm not waiting for her to change in order for me to feel free. What I know now is that revenge, when rooted in truth and boundaries, isn't about destroying someone else. It's about reclaiming yourself. It's about looking in the mirror, at 75, with every wrinkle earned, and saying, I still matter. My voice still counts. My story is still mine to tell. That's the lesson I carry forward. And it's the one I hope my grandchildren, my neighbors, and anyone who's ever felt dismissed by age or circumstance will take from me: you are never too old to demand respect, and never too small to enforce it. The day the last check from the garnishment cleared, I walked to the bank in my best navy blue coat, the one Martha always said made me look stately. The young teller who handed me the receipt smiled politely, unaware of the weight that piece of paper carried. To her, it was just another transaction. To me, it was a closing chapter. When I stepped outside, the September air was cool, crisp, the kind that hinted at autumn just beginning to paint the Ohio trees. I stood there for a moment, watching leaves tumble across the sidewalk, and felt a kind of stillness settle inside me. Not victory, not exactly, but peace. Across town, Rebecca's boutique windows still sat dark, covered in paper. I hadn't driven past in weeks, but people told me the for lease sign was still taped to the glass. Once, that news would have knifed me with sorrow. Now, it simply felt like truth standing in the daylight, harsh, undeniable, but cleansing. That evening, I brewed a pot of tea and sat on my porch swing, a notebook in my lap. I've always kept journals, little scraps of memory for myself. But this time, I began writing with others in mind, not family, not friends, but people like me. People who'd been written off as too old, too quiet, too fragile. I wrote about what it felt like to stand in a courtroom and hear my daughter call me a leech. I wrote about the sting of betrayal, yes, but also about the strength I found filing motions, sending certified letters, refusing to be erased. And then, at the very end of the page, I wrote 3 words in bold ink, asterisk I endured. I mattered, asterisk. That was my closing image, an old woman on her porch, not broken, not bitter, but steady. Watching the world turn gold in the evening light, knowing she had stood her ground and reclaimed her dignity. Maybe Rebecca would never come around. Maybe Mark would always hesitate when he called. Maybe my family would never gather in the same way again. But none of that undid the truth. I had survived betrayal and answered it with justice. If you're listening to this, maybe you've been where I've been. Maybe someone you trusted took advantage of your love, your loyalty, or your silence. Maybe they told you that you were too old, too weak, too dependent to fight back. But hear me now, you are not powerless. Your age is not your cage. You can still draw the line. You can still pick up the pen. You can still demand respect, even if it comes with cost, even if it means losing those you once thought you couldn't live without. I thought my story ended the day Rebecca spit in the court's direction and called me a leech. But the real ending wasn't anger. It was peace. The peace of knowing I did not let her lies define me. So I leave you with this: if you've been wronged, don't just bury it under silence. Speak. Stand. Write. File. Fight. Because sometimes revenge isn't about burning bridges, it's about building the only bridge you'll ever need, the one back to yourself. And if my story has spoken to you, don't let it stop here. Share it. Carry it forward. Remind someone else, someone who thinks their voice no longer matters, that it does. Because if a 75-year-old widow in Ohio can face her betrayer, take her to court, and walk away with her head high, then so can you. If this hit home, subscribe and tell me your state in the comments. Your story might be next.